So, today we're going to break down a really gripping fictional story that's been making the rounds online. It's called Operation Absolute Resolve, and it imagines a full-scale U.S. military takedown in Venezuela. We're going to unpack how this narrative builds its world, from the very first explosive moments all the way to its really political conclusion.
The story doesn't waste any time. It drops us right into the thick of it. The date is January 3rd, 2026. It's 2 in the morning in Caracas, and the city is fast asleep, with absolutely no idea that it's about to become the center of a geopolitical earthquake.
And then, just like that, the lights go out. A massive, sophisticated cyber attack hits the national power grid, and the entire city of Caracas is plunged into absolute darkness. But as the narrative makes clear, this isn't just some power outage. This is the opening shot of a perfectly planned invasion. And that brings us to the operation itself, which the story gives this very powerful, very decisive name: Operation Absolute Resolve. So let's take a look at how this whole assault actually unfolds. The way the story tells it, this is a stunningly coordinated attack. As the city goes dark, electronic warfare planes are blinding Venezuela's air defenses. And with the coast clear, over 150 U.S. aircraft just swarm in, Delta First choppers drop onto the presidential compound, and in just a few moments, they've captured President Nicolas Maduro and his wife before they can even make it to their panic room. And in a really wild modern twist, the story has President Trump watching the whole thing on a live feed from Florida. I mean, think about it. An elected president literally snatched from his home by a foreign power. It's a shocking idea, even in a fictional story. It really begs the question, how did things get so bad between the U.S. and Venezuela that an operation like this could even be imagined? Well, to answer that, the narrative has to rewind the clock and dive into the long, really complicated history between these two countries. It's a story that's basically built on two things: politics and, of course, oil. The story lays out a history that stretches back more than a century. Right after independence, Venezuela's fate gets tied up with the U.S., which, under this thing called the Monroe Doctrine, basically appoints itself the guardian of the Americas. But the real game changer? That comes in 1914, when they discover oil. That oil money completely transforms the country, and by the 1950s, it makes Venezuela one of the richest economies on the planet. But that entire trajectory gets thrown for a loop in 1998, when Hugo Chavez is elected, and he sets the country on a direct collision course with the United States. The narrative points to this core economic problem that really haunted the country, something called Dutch disease. And it's a total paradox, right? Because Venezuela was making so much money from oil, its currency got super strong. And that made it way cheaper to just import everything, food, cars, you name it, than to actually make it at home. And the result? Other critical industries like farming and manufacturing just withered away. And this chart just gives you a perfect snapshot of the consequences. The story states that an incredible 95% of all of Venezuela's export earnings came from oil. Just oil. The entire country's economy was balanced on this one single thing, which made it unbelievably vulnerable to the global market. So when Hugo Chavez gets into power, he kicks off his Bolivian revolution. He goes all in, nationalizing the oil industry, seizing assets from big U.S. companies. But he didn't stop there. He very deliberately built strong relationships with American rivals like Russia, China, and Iran. The story frames this as a direct challenge to U.S. power in its own hemisphere. Okay, so after Chavez's death, his hand-picked successor, Nicolas Maduro, takes over. And it's under his watch that all of the country's long-simmering problems just boil over and turn into a full-on catastrophe. Just look at that number. It's almost impossible to wrap your head around. The story claims that by 2018, Venezuela's hyperinflation rate hit a mind-boggling 1,700,000%. Your currency basically became worthless overnight. It was a sign of total economic collapse. The narrative describes a complete perfect storm of events. First, global oil prices cratered, which just ripped the floor out from under the economy. Then, in response to what the government was doing, the U.S. hit them with crippling sanctions. This led to just horrific shortages of food and medicine, which fueled a massive migration crisis. The country's GDP just plummeted. And the final straw, according to this story, was a disputed election in 2024 that set the stage for this intervention. So, with the country in total chaos, the narrative then shifts its focus back to the U.S. and gets into the nitty-gritty, almost cinematic details of how Operation Absolute Resolve was planned. The story gives us a final trigger, a public challenge, a dare from Maduro himself, Apparently, when the US told him to step down, he said, "Come get me, I'll wait here." In the story, this becomes the final justification they need to greenlight the operation.
The way the preparation is described, it's like something straight out of a spy thriller. First, the CIA uses drones and agents on the ground to map out Maduro's entire daily routine. Then, they get their big break. They manage to flip an insider, someone close to Maduro, and turn them into an asset. With that key intelligence, U.S. commandos then build a full-scale replica of his safe house in Kentucky and just rehearse the raid again and again and again, until it's absolutely perfect. So, from a purely military point of view, the operation is a massive success. But the geopolitical fallout, as the story details, is immediate and it is intense.
The story includes this quote attributed to President Trump, and it just perfectly captures the surreal, almost detached nature of the whole event. It felt like I was watching a television show. It really highlights this idea of modern warfare as a kind of spectator sport, watched on screens from thousands of miles away. The international backlash is swift and it is furious. American adversaries like Russia and China, well, they condemn the act in the strongest possible terms. Even neighbors in the region like Brazil express deep concern. And inside Venezuela itself, it's just pure chaos. Yeah, the opposition celebrates, but with Maduro gone, there's this huge, dangerous power vacuum, leaving the country's future more up in the air than ever. And this brings us to the story's final point, its big argument. It zooms way out from this one fictional event to suggest that, hey, this isn't just an isolated fantasy. It's actually part of a much larger, recurring pattern in American foreign policy. This right here is where the narrative makes its biggest and maybe most controversial point. It puts the fictional takedown of Maduro right alongside real-world U.S. interventions, drawing a direct line between them all. It points to a pattern: Iraq and the justification of WMDs, Libya, humanitarian intervention, Panama, and drug trafficking. The story suggests that every single time there's a public reason that leads to regime change, and absolute resolve is just the next chapter in that same book. And that leads directly to the narrative's central thesis, that the public justifications, promoting democracy, fighting tyranny, that they're often just a pretext. The story argues that the real, consistent motive underneath it all is about protecting America's own strategic and economic interests, especially when it comes to controlling vital resources. At the end of the day, Operation Absolute Resolve is a story. It's fiction. But the fact that it's so detailed, so plausible, and so popular, well, that reveals something very real about our anxieties today. Anxieties about power, about the spectacle of modern war, and about the very messy legacy of foreign intervention.